The hall was enormous. That was the first thing anyone noticed. When they walked into the Grand Assembly of the Galactic Council, the ceiling was so high that it was hard to see where it ended. The walls were covered in glowing artwork that moved slowly, like living paintings. The light inside was soft and golden, and the air smelled slightly different in every section because each part of the hall was set up for a different kind of alien breathing. 700 species used this room. Every one of them had left a mark on it. Calvin Hurst had been sitting in it for 11 hours. He was a tall man on the thinner side with short brown hair that had started to go gray at the edges sometime in the last 2 years. He wore the standard Earth diplomatic jacket, dark blue with a small flag patch on the left shoulder, and he had loosened the top button somewhere around hour 4. His chair was padded but not comfortable. Nothing in this hall was truly comfortable. Calvin had decided long ago that this was probably intentional. He shifted in his seat and looked down at the small screen built into his armrest. His aide Petra Akefer sat one seat to his left, and she had been quietly keeping a running log of everything that had happened since the session began. Calvin looked at the numbers. 47 formal statements of grievance, 19 procedural motions, 6 requests for clarification that had each required their own separate votes to resolve, 1 very long speech from the Urathi delegation about the definition of ownership as it applied to empty space. None of it had been about the war yet. Not really. And the Kth Dominion had arrived in the Varath system 6 days ago. They had brought 300 warships and parked them at the edge of the system like a threat left on someone's doorstep. Their lead speaker, a figure called High Speaker Voron, had been standing at the central platform for what felt like most of Calvin's adult life. Voron was tall, covered in scales that caught the light, and had 3 mouths, all of which were capable of speaking at the same time in a carefully arranged way that translated into something like formal legal speech. Right now, all 3 mouths were busy. The Dominion does not accept the authority of this body to place limits on our movement through unclaimed space. Voron was saying, the law of stellar primacy, which was written by our ancestors before this council existed, it gives us every right to be where we are. The room responded with a long, rolling sound, not quite a murmur, not quite a groan. Calvin had learned to read those sounds. They were as much a part of this hall as the speeches themselves. This one meant that most of the delegations were uncomfortable and did not want to pick a side. Petra leaned slightly toward him. The Aurelian bloc is going to abstain again, she said quietly. I know, Calvin said. He picked up his coffee thermos, remembered it was empty, and put it back down. He's been speaking for 2 hours and 19 minutes on this section alone, Petra added. How long until he finishes? No way to know. He has 17 more listed points. Calvin looked at the platform. Voron was gesturing now, down his 3 sets of arms, moving in different directions to emphasize different parts of his argument. It was impressive in a strange way, like watching 3 speakers all saying the same thing from 3 different angles. The Helvari delegation, seated across the hall in their long atmospheric suits, sat perfectly still. They had been perfectly still for most of the session. The only sign that they were paying attention was that none of them had left the Helvari Confederation. Was the other party in this dispute? Their outer system sat along the edge of Kaith expansion routes, the Kaith said. That space belonged to no one. The Helvari said that the planets inside that space belonged to them, both. Statements were true in different ways, which was exactly why the problem was so hard to solve and why everyone had been talking about it for 2 days without getting anywhere. Calvin tapped the screen on his armrest. He scrolled through the session schedule. After Voron finished, the Helvari delegation would speak, then the floor would open to secondary parties, which meant every other delegation. The room that had a formal position. Earth was listed 31st on that list. 31st, he did the rough math in his head. If each speaker took 30 minutes on average, which was optimistic, Earth would get a speak in about 15 hours. That assumed no procedural interruption, which was never a safe assumption. The realistic number was probably closer to 18 or 20 hours from now. He looked at Petra. She looked back at him with a calm expression that meant she had already done the same math and reached the same conclusion some time ago. Calvin stood up. The Celsian diplomat to his right noticed immediately. Celsians had 6 eyes and 4 of them turned toward him. The high speaker is still addressing the chamber, the Celsian said in a tone that was more confused than scolding. He is, Calvin agreed. I'm going to get some coffee. I'll be back. The session is ongoing. The session will still be ongoing when I return, Calvin said pleasantly. He picked up his empty thermos and his small communications pad and walked toward the side corridor without hurrying. Nobody stopped him. A few heads turned. The Celsian watched him go with what looked like genuine bewilderment. Calvin did not look back, and the corridor outside the main hall was wide and well lit with a slightly different kind of quiet, not the silence of attention but the silence of things happening slowly. There were vendor alcoves along one wall, a bench near a window that looked out over the landing platforms, and a few other figures who had made the same decision Calvin had, that watching a speech was not always the same as participating in it. He found the cart near the middle of the corridor. It belonged to a Duvari named As, who had been working this corridor for longer than Calvin had been alive, and who knew more about the dynamics of the council than most of the diplomats who passed his cart every day. As was short, round-bodied, with 4 small arms and a face that never changed expression but still somehow managed to convey a great deal. See, Ambassador Hurst, As said. He was already reaching for the right blend of coffee before Calvin had said a word. Difficult morning. Difficult 11 hours, Calvin said. He leaned against the cart and let himself relax for the first time since dawn. Voron has 17 more points. Said As. And then the Helvari speak, and then 30 other delegations. Calvin accepted the cup and took the first real sip of something warm in hours. Earth is 31st. As made a sound that was the Duvari equivalent of a slow, sad nod. A pair of Aurelian diplomats passed on their way to the bench near the window, carrying small containers of food. They nodded politely at Calvin as they went. He nodded back. The Aurelians were good at nodding politely at everyone, and it was how they had survived this long without ever committing to anything. Calvin watched them settle onto the bench and begin eating their lunch with the calm of people who had decided that whatever was happening in the hall, it could wait. He felt something at the edge of his mind, not quite a thought yet, more like the shape of one still forming. He drank his coffee and let it sit there. "The Kth Fleet," he said to us, not really asking a question. 300 ships, 6 days now. 6 days, Os confirmed. "They have not moved closer." "No," Calvin said. "They haven't." He looked out the window at the gray surface of the landing platform below and the pale sky beyond it. 6 days, 300 ships. Endless speeches. The shape at the edge of his mind got slightly clearer. He finished his coffee, handed back the cup, but then pulled out his communications pad. "Petra," he said into it, "still here?" She said, "Voron is on point 14. "Good. I need you to pull everything we have on the Kth economic situation. Trade figures, resource reports. Anything from the last 3 years." He paused. "And anything on the Helvari outer systems, what they produce, what they export." There was a short silence. "That's not what our prepared statement covers." "I know," he said. Another short silence. "Okay," Petra said. "I'll have it ready." Calvin put the pad away. He looked back at the corridor, at the Aurelians eating their lunch, at the quiet, steady work of a hall full of people waiting for something to change. He went back for a second cup before returning to his seat. The small side room had a table, 2 chairs, 1 communications terminal, and a window that looked out at a maintenance corridor. There were no paintings on the walls. There were no glowing murals or atmospheric processors adjusted for comfort. It was a plain room for plain work, and Calvin had used rooms exactly like it in 4 different council buildings across 3 different planets over the past 9 years. He liked them. Plain rooms were honest. Petra sat across the table from him with her pad in one hand and a second screen open on the surface between them. She had pulled the files he asked for, organized them into a readable order, and flagged the parts she thought were most relevant, all while sitting in the main assembly hall pretending to take notes on Voron's speech. Calvin had worked with a lot of aides over the years. Petra was the best. "Start with the Keth trade figures," he said. She slid the first set of data across the table. Calvin looked at it without picking it up. The Keth Dominion was old. That was the first thing the data made clear. Their civilization had been traveling between stars for 4,000 years before humanity figured out how to leave its own solar system. In that time, they had built 12 settled systems, a military with 300 active warships, a legal code that took up more storage space than most planets' entire archives, and a reputation as a species that got what it wanted through patience and pressure rather than sudden force. They were also quietly and consistently running short on resources. 8 years, Calvin said, reading from the trade figures. 8 years of declining output in their home systems, Petra confirmed. It's not dramatic. A nothing that shows up in their public statements or their official council filings. But the internal numbers, the ones our liaison pulled from secondary market data, show a consistent pattern. She leaned forward. They've been buying more than they're producing for 8 years. The gap has been covered by reserves and by purchasing through intermediary traders, but the reserves are getting Smaller and the intermediary prices have been going up because everyone knows the Keth are buying, Calvin said. Because everyone knows, she agreed. When you're a large civilization with a known need, the people selling to you raise their prices. It's basic market behavior. Calvin nodded slowly. He was looking at the second column of figures now, the ones that showed what the Keth had been buying. Isotopes are mostly rare elements used in their power generation systems, agricultural goods, processed materials that their own manufacturing capacity no longer produced efficiently. And the Helvari outer systems, he said. Petra switched to the second set of data. The Helvari runs 7 agri-worlds in the border zone, large-scale food production exported across 4 sectors. They also have 3 isotope-rich planetary bodies that nobody has fully mapped yet, but preliminary surveys show significant deposits of exactly what the Keth have been buying from intermediaries. Calvin sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was plain and white and had nothing interesting on it, and then looked back at the data. So the Keth need what the Helvari have, he said. They need it, Petra said. But there's a problem with just taking it. Tell me. A war destroys things. She pulled up a third file, this one a set of infrastructure assessments. The Helvari agri-worlds are productive because they have been maintained and developed over 200 years. The processing stations, the transport networks, the soil management systems, all of it is built up over generations. If the Keth launch a military campaign, and the Helvari resist, which they will, the fighting will damage or destroy significant portion of that infrastructure. She paused. Scorched fields do not feed populations. Bomb processing stations do not refine isotopes. How long to rebuild? Calvin asked. Conservative estimate: 15 to 20 years. Before the captured systems are producing at the level the Keth actually need. Calvin looked at her. And the Keth reserves last how long? At current consumption rates without any new supply, somewhere between 4 and 7 years. The room was quiet for a moment. So if they go to war and win, Calvin said slowly, they spend resources they don't have on a military campaign, take territory that will take 15 years to rebuild and run out of what they needed before the territory can give it to them. That is one way to read it, Petra said carefully. It's the way the numbers read it. Yes, she said. But numbers do not always decide what species do. Pride decides, history decides, what their home population expects from them decides. Calvin nodded. That was true. It was always true. He had sat across the table from enough delegations over the years to know that the logical choice and the chosen choice were often 2 different things, and that the gap between them was filled with exactly the kind of things Petra had named. But someone in the Keth leadership knows, he said. Someone has seen these same numbers. Probably more than one person, Petra said. The question is whether those people have enough influence to steer the Dominion in a different direction, or whether they're looking for an excuse to steer it that way without looking like they backed down. Calvin picked up his coffee. He had lost count of how many cups it was. Enough that he was no longer feeling the effect much, which meant his body had simply accepted coffee as its new baseline and was operating accordingly. He thought about what Oz had said in the corridor about how a species that had the ability to act but chose to speak was usually getting something from the speaking that the acting could not provide. He thought about 6 days of warships, sitting still at the edge of a system. He thought about 47 formal grievances, and 19 procedural motions and a speech that had 17 listed points. All of that talking had a cost. It cost time. It cost political credibility. It cost something in the Dominion's own internal politics, where factions who wanted action would be watching and waiting and getting more impatient with each passing day. The Keth were not simply talking because they liked talking. They were talking because they had not yet been offered a reason to stop. Petro, he said, what would a 10-year trade agreement between the Keth and the Helvari look like? In terms of supply volumes, what would the Keth actually need to cover their deficit? She looked at him. Then she looked at her pad. Then she looked at him again. That's not a question our prepared statement asks. No, he said. But can you answer it? She was quiet for a moment, running the figures in her head. Roughly speaking, yes. The Helvari outer systems, at current production capacity, could cover about 60% of the Keth isotope need and a significant portion of their agricultural import gap. She paused, with some adjustment to Helvari production targets, possibly more. And would that be better for the Helvari than a war? Considerably, she said. A trade agreement gives them income, security guarantees, and then keeps their infrastructure intact. A war, even if they win, costs them years of disruption. So it's better for both of them. Calvin said. Economically, yes. Petra set her pad down. The problem is that nobody has put this in front of either of them in a form they can act on. The Council has been focused on the legal question of whether the Keth fleet is allowed to be where it is. Nobody has asked why it is there. Calvin was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the 2 screens of data. He looked at his coffee. He thought about Earth's prepared statement, its 12 careful paragraphs, its calls for cessation of hostilities, its appeal to existing frameworks and established norms. It was a good statement. It was the kind of statement that satisfied the committees who had approved it, caused no diplomatic incidents, and then changed nothing. I need to rewrite what I'm going to say, he said. Petra did not look surprised. She looked like someone who had suspected this was coming for the past hour and had been deciding how she felt about it. How different, she asked. Shorter, he said. Much shorter. Calvin spent a long time looking at a blank screen. The data was there. He had read it twice, checked the numbers, and confirmed the logic with Petra, who was good enough at this kind of analysis that her confirmation meant something. The case was solid. The argument made sense. The hard part was not the argument. The hard part was what he was going to do with it. He had been a diplomat for 9 years. Before that, he had trained for 3. Before that, he had studied political science and international relations at a university back home, and where the classes talked about negotiation theory and strategic communication and the careful, methodical process of building agreements between parties who did not trust each other. He knew all of it. He had used all of it. in small ways and large ones, across 4 planets and dozens of sessions, in rooms exactly like this one. The prepared statement from his government was a product of all that knowledge. 12 paragraphs, every word reviewed, every sentence approved by 3 separate committees. It was careful and thorough and said nothing that could be argued with, which also meant it said nothing that could change anything. He pushed the prepared statement to the side of his screen, then he opened a new document and started writing. What he wrote was short. It did not have 12 paragraphs. It did not reference legal precedent or cite established frameworks. It asked one question and offered one answer, and it took him about 20 minutes to get the words right, which by diplomatic standards was extremely fast, and by normal standards was still quite a while to write 5 short paragraphs. Petra read it when he was done. She read it twice, then she set down her pad and looked at him. This is not what the committees approved, she said. No, he agreed. It's also not what Earth's diplomatic policy guidelines recommend for situations involving third-party conflicts. No. And it makes a specific economic proposal that our government has not officially authorized us to make. It makes a framework proposal, he said. There's a difference. A framework is an invitation to negotiate. It is not a binding commitment. Petra looked at him for a moment longer. She was 28 years old, which was young for this work, and she had the kind of intelligence that picked up subtext quickly and processed it without needing to talk through every step. You are going to get a call from the diplomatic corps, she said. Probably. They will be unhappy. Also probably. And you've decided to do it anyway. He looked at the short document on his screen. I've decided that the thing that might actually work is different from the thing that definitely won't, he said. And since we're going to be standing at that platform in a few hours either way, I would rather say the thing that might work. Petra was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded once, and in a way that meant she did not necessarily agree with the decision, but respected the reasoning behind it. I'll update your speaking notes, she said. They went back into the main hall about an hour before Earth's speaking slot. The session had continued in their absence the way a river continues when you step out of it steadily without noticing the gap. The 28th speaker was finishing when they returned to their seats. The 29th was a small delegation from a system Calvin had visited once, whose representative gave a careful statement about the importance of peaceful resolution that everyone in the room had already heard 17 variations of. Calvin sat and watched the hall. He had spent a lot of time in the past 11 hours watching this hall, but he looked at it differently now. But he was not watching to follow the proceedings, he was watching the people. The Helvari delegation had barely moved. In hours, their posture was the posture of people who were holding themselves very still, because stillness was what they could control. Their outer systems were the center of this dispute, their infrastructure, their farmlands, their resource deposits, all of it was sitting at the edge of a conversation about whether a war was going to happen. They had come to this hall to argue that it should not, and they had done so formally and thoroughly, and now they were waiting to find out if any of it had mattered. The Cath delegation was harder to read. Voron had taken his seat after his address. and he sat with the particular stillness of someone who was paying attention to everything while appearing to pay attention to nothing, and Calvin had seen that kind of stillness before. It was the stillness of someone who had said what they came to say and was now waiting to see what came back. The 29th speaker finished. Councillor Yem, the session chair, announced the Earth delegation with the flat efficiency of someone who had made this kind of announcement several hundred times. Calvin stood up. Petra touched his arm once as he moved toward the floor, not to stop him, just to make contact. He understood what it meant. He nodded and kept walking. The platform was in the center of the hall, slightly raised, with a translation array built into the podium that would carry his words to every species in the room in whatever form their biology could receive. Calvin had used this specific platform 3 times before. He knew how his voice would carry. He knew that the acoustics made every word equally clear in every section of the room. He set his notes on the podium. He looked out at the hall, 700 species worth of tired, patient, cautious diplomats looked back at him. He did not read the prepared statement. "I will be brief," he said. "The council has heard many thorough arguments today, and I do not plan to add another long one." A few heads shifted. In the Cath section, Voron turned slightly toward the platform. "The Earth delegation has looked carefully at this situation," Calvin continued, "and we have reached a conclusion that we want to share. Plainly, the Cath Dominion has a real resource need. This is not a secret. If you look at the available data, their home systems are producing less than they need. They have been buying from intermediaries at increasing cost for 8 years. What the Helvari outer systems produce is exactly what the Cath have been trying to find elsewhere." The hall was very quiet. Not the performative quiet of formal session, the genuine quiet of a room that was listening. "The Helvari Confederation has a real security need," he went on. 300 warships at your border is a serious situation, regardless of the legal arguments about what rights exist in unclaimed space. That concern is also real." He paused. He let the pause sit. "Earth would like to propose that, instead of continuing to debate who is correct in a legal sense, the Council help both parties negotiate directly. Specifically, a 10-year trade agreement covering isotope supply and agricultural goods, fixed pricing, access guarantees, though a clear security arrangement for Helvari territory, a withdrawal schedule for the Cath fleet." He kept his voice level and his pace steady. "Earth is willing to act as a neutral party in those negotiations and to offer our own commercial networks as a supply buffer during any transition period. Based on our analysis, this arrangement would give the Cath Dominion more of what they actually need than a military campaign would, and it would give the Helvari Confederation more stability and security than they currently have." Calvin looked across the hall toward Voron. Voron looked back. His 3 mouths were closed. His expression did not change. But he was looking. "I am available to speak with either delegation at any time," Calvin said. "Thank you." He stepped down from the platform. The hall did not applaud. They said did not murmur or react in any of the usual ways. It held a particular kind of silence that Calvin had only heard a handful of times in 9 years of diplomatic work. It was the silence of people doing fast, quiet math. Counselor Yem called a recess 38 minutes. After Calvin stepped off the platform. This was unusual. Recesses in the Grand Assembly were typically scheduled at fixed intervals, and rarely called early unless something had gone wrong with the ventilation or someone had fainted. Calling a recess in the middle of the speaking order with 12 delegations still waiting for their slot meant that something had shifted. Calvin was back at Oz's cart in the corridor outside before most of the delegations had finished filing out of the hall. That was a short statement, Oz said, handing over a cup without being asked. Yawn, it was the right length, Calvin said. He leaned against the cart and watched. The corridor filled slowly with the usual mix of aides, advisors, and senior diplomats who were now all checking their communications and speaking quietly to their colleagues. The energy was different from the usual recess energy. People were moving with more purpose. The Cath side section emptied fast, appearing at his shoulder. She had her pad in her hand and was watching the corridor with the focused look of someone cataloging everything. She saw 3 of Varon's senior aides went toward the private consultation wing, not the restrooms, not the vendor alcoves, the consultation wing. How long ago? About 4 minutes. Before the recess was even officially announced. Calvin took a slow sip of coffee. And the consultation wing was on the other side of the building, and it was restricted access. Only delegations with active sessions had clearance to use the rooms there. The Keth delegation still had active session status. They had the right to be there, but 4 minutes before the recess was announced meant someone in the Keth delegation had started moving immediately after Calvin stepped off the platform while the next speaker was still being introduced. That was fast. That was people who had been sitting very still for a very long time and had suddenly found a reason to move. Good, Calvin said. Petra looked at him sideways. Good. It means someone heard something worth responding to. Or it means they're angry and going to file a formal objection to Earth's statement. That's also possible, he agreed. And he said it calmly because it was true. He had made a proposal that the Keth had not asked for, framed in terms of what the Keth needed rather than what the Keth were entitled to. Some factions within the Dominion would read that as respectful and practical. Other factions would read it as an implication that the Keth could not simply take what they wanted, which was a different message entirely, and one that would produce a very different reaction. He did not know which faction was in that consultation room right now. The Helvari foreign minister sent a message, Petra added. He wants to meet private room, his request. Tell him yes. 20 minutes. He said 10. 20, Calvin said. I need to eat. A S produced a wrapped meal suitable for human digestion without needing to be asked about that either. And Calvin ate standing at the cart, watching the corridor, thinking through the conversation he was about to have. Helvari Foreign Minister Drayle was a careful individual. Calvin had met him twice before the session briefly at the kind of large diplomatic events where you shook hands with 40 people in an evening and remembered 3 of them. Drayle had been one of the 3. He asked precise questions, listened to full answers before responding, and had the manner of someone who had spent a Long career learning not to show what he was thinking until he had decided what to do with the thought. The private room Drayle had requested was small, with a round table and no screens, just 2 chairs and a window. Drayle was already seated when Calvin arrived, with one aide standing near the wall and a second at the door, and Calvin sat down across from him. Drayle studied him for a moment. "Your statement was not what we expected from Earth," he said. "No," Calvin agreed. "You identified Keth resource needs as a legitimate basis for negotiation. Some in my delegation felt that framed the Dominion's position more sympathetically than the situation warranted." "The situation is what it is," Calvin said. "The Keth have a need. That doesn't give them the right to take your territory, but it does give them a reason that's worth addressing directly, because addressing it is the only way to make this stop." Drayle was quiet for a moment. "And you believe a trade agreement would make it stop?" "I believe a trade agreement would give the Keth leadership something to bring back to their own population that isn't a retreat," Calvin said. "And right now, they have 300 ships at your border and a set of legal arguments that aren't persuading anyone. If they go home without a war, they look like they failed. But if they go home with a 10-year supply agreement that covers their resource deficit, they can tell their people they achieved the goal through negotiation instead of force. And if they go home with our territory, they tell their people they achieved it through force," Drayle said. "Yes, that's also an option for them." And GT clears throat. And GT, I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Calvin looked at the foreign minister directly. "But the force option costs them more than they can currently afford and takes longer to deliver results than they have time for. The negotiation option costs them pride in the short term and gives them stability in the long term, and someone in their leadership knows this. The question is whether they have room to act on it. And you think your proposal gives them that room?" "I think it opens a door," Calvin said. "What they do with the door is still up to them." Drayle asked 7 more questions over the next 30 minutes. They were specific, careful questions about supply volumes and pricing mechanisms and what security provisions would look like in practice. Calvin answered each one directly. Where he did not have a precise answer, he said so. This seemed to affect Drayle in a noticeable way, not dramatically, but there was a slight change in his posture. After the third honest admission of uncertainty, a slight relaxation of the careful stillness he had been bracing against had not appeared. When the meeting ended, Drayle stood and offered the formal Helvari acknowledgement of a concluded conversation, a gesture with both hands, palms forward. "I will consult with my delegation," he said. "Of course," Calvin said. He walked back to the main corridor. Petra was waiting near a S's cart. "How did it go?" she asked. "He asked good questions," Calvin said. "He'll go back and talk to his people. Then we wait. The Keth aides are still in the consultation wing," Petra said. "They've been in there for over an hour now." "Still good," Calvin said, "or still bad?" "Or still bad," he agreed. He ordered another coffee. The afternoon light through the corridor windows was starting to go pale and yellow the way it did on Verith Prime when the day was turning toward evening. The session had started before dawn. It might go past midnight, and Calvin drank his coffee and waited, which was most of what diplomatic work was when you got down to it. The message came through the council's formal channel at just past 8:00 in the evening local time. It was brief and written in the careful language of official council communication, which meant it had been reviewed by at least 3 parties before being sent. It requested a closed session between the Keth Dominion, the Helvari Confederation, and the Earth Delegation, to be facilitated by Counselor Yim. It was not an agreement, it was an invitation to sit in a room together and talk about whether an agreement was possible, which in diplomatic terms was approximately the distance between nothing and something. Calvin read it twice in the main corridor outside the assembly hall and standing near A.S.'s card with his 7th or 8th cup of coffee going cold in his hand. "That's promising," A.S. said, reading his face. "It's a start," Calvin said. "In my experience," A.S. said, "a start is usually the hardest part." Calvin thought about that. He thought about 6 days of warships at a systems edge. He thought about 11 hours of speeches and 47 formal grievances, and a speech with 17 listed points. He thought about Drayle asking careful questions in a small room with no screens, and about Keth aides moving quickly toward a consultation wing 4 minutes before a recess was officially called. A start was not the hardest part. The hardest part was usually the middle, when both sides had committed enough to feel exposed and not enough to feel secure. But a start was necessary for a middle, and so he would take it. "Petra," he said into his communications pad, "we have a closed session request. Can you set up our prep materials?" "Already started," she said. "I saw the message come through." "Do you want the full briefing pack or the short version?" "Short version, we don't have long." The closed session took place in one of the council's smaller conference rooms, a space designed specifically for this kind of conversation. No public gallery, no translation broadcast to outside parties, just the 3 delegations and Counselor Yim at a circular table that was built to make it unclear who was sitting across from who. This was intentional. Tables without a clear opposite side were easier for negotiation than ones with a clear line down the middle. Voren attended personally, which Calvin had not been certain would happen. He brought 2 senior aides and a technical advisor. The Helvari sent Foreign Minister Drayle and 3 members of his team. Calvin brought Petra and 1 other aide, a quiet and thorough young man named Greg Sato, who was good at keeping accurate notes under pressure. The first hour was difficult in the way that first hours usually were. Voren restated the Keth position. Drayle restated the Helvari position. Both restatements were shorter than the public speeches had been, which was progress of a kind. Counselor Yim asked clarifying questions with the patience of someone who had done this many times and understood that the first hour was less about content and more about the 2 parties establishing that they were willing to be in the same room. Calvin mostly listened. He spoke when he was asked to, and twice when he was not asked to, but felt that something needed to be said plainly. Both times he said the thing plainly, without softening it, and both times the room got very quiet for a moment and then moved forward. The second hour was better. The Cath technical advisor put specific numbers on the table regarding what the Dominion needed in terms of isotope supply. The Helvari team had brought production data for their outer systems. There was a period of about 20 minutes during which the technical people on both sides were talking to each other in the specific language of logistics and output capacity, and the senior diplomats on both sides were watching this happen with the particular expression of people who had expected to keep arguing for much longer. Calvin drank water, then he had switched from coffee an hour ago on the understanding that he needed to be clear-headed for this part. He watched the technical conversation and let it go where it needed to go. Draw leaned slightly toward him at one point and said very quietly, "Your analysis was accurate. The numbers are straightforward once you look at them together," Calvin said, equally quietly. "We had the same numbers," Drawl said. "We did not look at them together." Calvin nodded. There was nothing useful to add to that. The session ran past midnight. At the end of it, there was no signed agreement. There was a shared document with a proposed framework, a list of open issues that both sides had agreed were the right issues to be arguing about, in a scheduled second session for 2 days later. But Counselor Yem noted the session closed with the formal language of official council process, which meant that what had happened in the room was now part of the record. It was not a solution, but it was a shape that a solution could eventually fit into. 3 days into the follow-up sessions, the Cath fleet began to move. Not away from the system, not yet. But it pulled back from the edge, creating more distance between itself and the Helvari border. It was not announced, no statement was made. The movement was simply noted by sensors across the system and reported quietly by the delegations who monitored such things. In the room where the sessions were being held, the atmosphere changed when this became known. It did not change dramatically. Nobody stood up and made a speech about it. But something that had been very tightly held by everyone at the table loosened slightly, and the conversations that followed were shorter and more direct than the ones before. Drawl, during a brief break, stood with Calvin near the window of the conference room. The Vareth Prime sky outside was deep blue at this hour, with 2 of the planet's 3 moons visible near the horizon. The fleet moved, Drawl said. It was not quite a question. It moved, Calvin confirmed. Drawl was quiet for a moment. "My delegation was skeptical of your proposal when you made it. Several of my advisors felt that naming the Cath need openly would be read as weakness." "It's a reasonable concern," Calvin said. "They were wrong," Drawl said with the plain tone of someone who had decided to simply say the thing rather than frame it carefully, and naming it gave the Cath something to accept rather than something to defeat. Calvin nodded. He looked out at the moons on the horizon. Word of the closed sessions had spread through the council community in the quiet way that news always spread in this building, through aides and advisors and corridor conversations and people who heard things from people who had been in rooms. When Calvin walked the main corridor the next morning, Oz had his coffee ready before Calvin had reached the cart. "People are talking," Oz said. "People always talk here," Calvin said. "They are talking about Earth," Oz said. "About you, about what you said from the platform." Calvin drank his coffee. He did not say anything for a moment. Someone else would have found the same answer eventually, he said. Numbers were there. the situation was. There, I would just needed someone to say it plainly instead of carefully. Oz made the sound that meant he disagreed but was not going to argue about it. There is a difference, Oz said, between knowing something and saying it. In the right room at the right time. Calvin thought about 11 hours of speeches. He thought about an empty coffee thermos and a maintenance corridor window and a shape at the edge of his mind that had slowly gotten clearer. He thought about a platform in the center of the largest room he had ever been in, and 5 short paragraphs in the particular silence of a hall full of people doing fast, quiet math. Maybe, he said. He handed back the cup, thought for a moment, and handed it back for a refill. He had another session in an hour. There was still a long way to go. But the fleet had moved.